I learned early that in my mother's house, silence was never interpreted as discipline. It was treated as consent, as vacancy, as a seat I could be removed from without protest. The lesson did not arrive in childhood with one dramatic cruelty. It arrived in polished increments, a conversation that continued after I entered the room as though I were staff, a family photograph where I was asked to hold someone's coat instead of stand in frame, a scholarship announcement where my surname was pronounced correctly only for my stepbrother. By the time my father died, the pattern had matured into policy. I had become the daughter who handled practical burdens and absorbed ceremonial exclusions, the one praised for reliability and denied authority in the same breath. My name is Avery Cooper, and I am telling this plainly because the language used around me was always designed to make displacement sound civilized. The conference room at Halbrecht and Wynne was all transparency and control, 4 walls of glass looking onto a corridor lined with abstract paintings, and low, expensive lighting meant to flatter faces under strain. Inside, nothing softened. Fluorescent strips washed the walnut table in a clinical sheen, and polished brass nameplates marked every place setting with role and rank: counsel for estate, corporate trustee liaison, acting executor, beneficiary representative. Even the 2 junior associates had engraved identifiers and tablets synced to the docket. My chair had a legal pad and a capped pen, no plate, no title, no designation that tied me to the family name carved into the trust instruments stacked in front of us. Across from me, my mother sat with her posture curated to communicate grief and command at once. Black silk, pearl earrings, hands folded over a cream folder containing my father's estate packet. Dalton sat to her right, tailored charcoal suit, navy tie, expression carefully solemn in the way people become solemn when they know they are about to receive power publicly. The notary introduced herself, voice formal and neutral. For the record, this probate conference concerns the estate of Richard Cooper, deceased, with supplemental corporate governance filings attached. She verified identities, recorded appearances, and asked whether all present acknowledged jurisdiction and venue. I answered yes when prompted, and no one looked up. My mother answered yes, and received a nod from 3 people at once. That hierarchy had structure, and structure is what makes humiliation durable. When exclusion is ritualized, it no longer resembles rudeness, it resembles order. A tray of untouched water glasses sat near the end of the table. Condensation pooled under mine and soaked the corner of my notes while opposing counsel flipped pages and discussed transition continuity. No one said my father's first name after the opening minute. No one mentioned the last month of his life. My mother slid the packet across the table to Dalton with one controlled movement and then looked directly at me. "Sit down, Avery," she said, as if I had disrupted proceedings by existing at full height. "You were never meant to lead this family." Her diction was mild, almost maternal, the way a person might correct table manners before guests. The sentence landed harder for that reason. It carried history in it, not a disagreement over one filing, but a verdict she had rehearsed for years, that I could be useful, even admired in carefully bounded spaces, but never recognized where decisions hardened into law. I stayed standing for one breath too long, long enough to feel every gaze move from my face to my shoulders to my hands, assessing whether I would perform anger for the room. Then I sat without argument, because I had already spent a decade discovering that reactive pain becomes evidence against women in legal rooms, especially when men in tailored jackets are prepared to call composure cold and grief instability. When the notary read the dispositive sections, her cadence did not shift. Controlling inheritance rights transfer to beneficiary Dalton Pierce Cooper under supervising executor authority. Voting shares in Cooper Marine Systems to be assigned pursuant to attached governance memorandum. Lake Property Trust to be administered by successor fiduciary as designated herein. She paused only to confirm initials on each page, then continued through personal bequests, charitable directives, and transfer mechanics. The language was procedural, but procedure can erase you more efficiently than cruelty if you allow it to operate without challenge. Counsel asked whether there were objections at this stage. My mother answered first, no objections from immediate family. Then she added, turning slightly so the room could hear benevolence in her voice, "This reflects what Richard wanted. We are honouring stability." The phrase immediate family entered the record without my name attached to it. A junior associate typed eyes on screen and did not miss a keystroke. 2 assistants entered at the notary's break and arranged people for photographs required for internal estate documentation, donor communications, and corporate transition notices. "Immediate heirs only for the first set," one said with practiced politeness, hand already guiding chairs into a neat arc. My mother stood, touched Dalton's sleeve, and positioned him at centre beneath the Cooper crest embossed on the conference binder. I rose halfway from my chair and waited for instruction that did not come. One assistant gave me a brief apologetic glance and then looked away, because apology without intervention is the social lubricant of institutions. I stepped back from the frame and watched my mother smooth Dalton's lapel as the camera clicked. 3 fast captures that would circulate before sunset with captions about continuity, legacy, and stewardship. In those images, there would be no evidence that another child of Richard Cooper had been present when authority changed hands. The cleanest injuries are the ones no one can point to as injuries. No one shouted, no one threatened me, no one used language that would scandalize a court. They only arranged facts and faces so that my absence looked administrative. That was my core wound, not being unloved in private, but being edited out in public by people who understood governance, optics, and the difference between cruelty that can be quoted and exclusion that can be justified. 5 years earlier, at a foundation dinner, my mother introduced me as our practical daughter, excellent support staff in any emergency. And the table laughed with relief, relieved that hierarchy had been clarified before confusion could spread. 3 years earlier, when my father appointed me interim lead during a compliance incident, she called cousins and said I lacked the temperament for sustained authority. 9 months before he died, I finalised a crisis governance plan that prevented a creditor run on one of our subsidiaries, and the board thank you note addressed me as A. Cooper, Administrative Support. These were not isolated slights, they were a record of intent. By the second week after the funeral, I had begun requesting every underlying filing, every transmission log, every notarial registry reference tied to my father's estate documents, not because I expected dramatic betrayal, but because paper trails have a different morality than families do. Paper does not need to love you to tell the truth. In my line of work, the first principle is never to argue from injury when evidence can argue from sequence. Who drafted the instrument? Who witnessed execution when metadata changed? Why a seal number appears in one place and not another? These are the quiet hinges that move whole rooms. I kept my voice measured in correspondence, thanked people who ignored me, filed formal requests when informal access was denied, and logged every denial by date and sender. If they wanted me reduced to sentiment, I would stay inside procedure until procedure exposed what sentiment concealed. Back in the conference room, while the notary organised signature tabs and counsel reviewed next steps for share transfer, I pressed my thumb against the edge of my legal pad and read my own notes to prevent my face from speaking. Grief was still raw enough to ache physically, but I had no intention of offering that ache as performance. My father had taught me 2 contradictory lessons that only made sense together once I was older. Loyalty matters, and documentation matters more when loyalty fails. He was not an easy man, not sentimental, not skilled at apology, but he trusted precision. When I was 17 and balancing invoices for his marina division, he marked one ledger entry with red ink and said, "You do not win by being louder. You win by being correct when the room is tired." That sentence returned to me now with almost metallic clarity, and I realized that my mother had mistaken my restraint for surrender in the same way she always had. She saw stillness and assumed vacancy. She saw discipline and assumed defeat. The meeting concluded with schedules, signatures, and polite departures. Counsel shook Dalton's hand first, then my mother's, then mine as an afterthought, as if courtesy could be distributed by descending order of relevance. In the corridor outside, glass reflected us as a temporary tableau, my mother already speaking to communications staff about the announcement language, Dalton checking his phone while an assistant carried his folder, me holding a legal pad with water-warped corners and 3 pages of names, times, and docket references written in block letters. No one stopped me when I walked to the elevator. No one asked whether I needed support. They believed the matter had been settled because settlement had been staged. I pressed the lobby button and watched the floor numbers descend, feeling the old pressure in my chest settle into something colder and more useful. Silence was not peace. It was surrender, and I was done surrendering. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby's marble brightness, and the first thing I heard was applause. It rolled across the atrium in a practice burst, not spontaneous grief, but donor-grade acknowledgement, the kind timed to camera shutters and microphones being lowered. Halbrecht and Wynne had converted the reception floor into a transition announcement within the hour. White orchids on chrome stands, portable lights angled toward a lectern draped with the Cooper Marine crest. The scent of coffee and furniture polish sat beneath expensive perfume. I stepped out holding my legal pad, and 3 people with event badges looked through me as if I were late support staff. My mother stood at the lectern with Dalton at her shoulder, one hand on his sleeve, and the law firm's communications director to her left, holding talking points on heavy cream paper. Behind them, a wall monitor displayed my father's portrait in uniform beside the words, "Continuity of Leadership." I recognized half the faces in the crowd, 2 retired admirals from the Veterans Foundation Board, our company's outside auditors, regional partners, cousins who had declined to return my calls during my father's final hospitalization. Their attention was fixed on the stage geometry, widow-centered, sun-elevated, future-arranged. I had not been invited to this floor, but my access badge still opened the elevator, and that small administrative lag became my only accidental entry to my own family narrative. "Marianne, one statement on governance transition," a reporter asked from the front row. My mother nodded with controlled solemnity. Richard believed in clear succession and operational steadiness. "Dalton has prepared for this responsibility for years." She turned just enough to include him in the frame. "He understands legacy, and he understands command." A board member raised his glass. "To Dalton Cooper. To Dalton," the room repeated. I remained near a column at the back, inside sightline but outside circle, and for one brief second I believed I could leave without being named. Then my mother's eyes found me the way a searchlight finds metal, not because she wanted me close, but because a mission is never complete until it is witnessed. "There's Avery," she said into the microphone, voice warm enough to pass for kindness. Heads turned in sequence. "Our practical daughter, excellent under pressure with internal logistics. She keeps files moving when real leadership is occupied." Soft laughter followed, polite and quick, the sound people make when they are told where not to look. The communications director smiled without showing teeth. Dalton did not laugh. He adjusted his cuff and stared at the monitor. My mother lifted a hand as if beckoning me into family proximity, then redirected it toward the side wall where catering staff waited. "Stand there, Avery. Please don't crowd the principal frame." The sentence hung in fluorescent air. No one objected. One of the junior associates from upstairs, a man who had addressed me as Ms. Cooper in private correspondence for 3 years, stepped toward me and murmured, "If you could remain off camera for this segment, we'd appreciate it." He said "we" as if neutrality lived in pronouns. Every muscle in my shoulders tightened. I wanted to step forward, take the microphone, read the dispositive language aloud, and ask the room to define immediate family with legal precision. I wanted to ask why continuity required erasure. I wanted to force eye contact one person at a time until someone admitted that obedience and truth were different things. Instead, I moved exactly 2 paces back until my spine met cold glass, opened my legal pad, and wrote the quote verbatim with timestamp, 4:42 p.m. Practical daughter, internal logistics, real leadership. Then I wrote names of audible witnesses. Injury can become testimony only when recorded before memory edits it for survival. The Q&A continued as if my placement were a minor technical correction. A reporter asked whether there had been any contest to the succession instruments. My mother lowered her eyes in measured sorrow. "Grief creates confusion. We are all processing, but there is no substantive dispute. Our immediate heirs are aligned." Dalton finally spoke, reading from the printed sheet without lifting his head. "We intend to honor my father's service, protect employee stability, and preserve shareholder confidence." The Veterans Board Chair nodded gravely. "That is what your father would have wanted." I watched his mouth form the phrase and felt a memory surface with painful precision. My father in the boatyard office at 19, handing me a binder of compliance protocols and saying, "You'll be blamed for whatever you prevent, because prevention is invisible." He had not been gentle with me, but he had been exact. In that room, exactness was the only inheritance I still trusted. A photographer announced, "Family shot, please. Immediate heirs and acting executor at centre." People shifted to clear a path around the lectern. My mother positioned herself in front, Dalton to the right, two trustees behind them in a shallow arc. I stayed where I was until the photographer looked at me and then at my mother for instruction. "Not this set," my mother said. "Avery will handle archive copies afterward." Handle archive copies. Another title without rank. I could feel the room studying my face for reaction. Public spaces train themselves to detect female rupture. They are less interested in what was done than in whether the target remains decorous. If I cried, I would be fragile. If I argued, I would be unstable. If I laughed, I would be cruel. There are rooms where every available emotion becomes self-incrimination. I kept my hands still at my sides and asked the photographer evenly, "Please include me in at least one legal record image for attendance verification." He looked to my mother again. She answered before he could. "Administrative attendance is in the sign-in log. Proceed." The shutter snapped 6 times. My exclusion became an image asset. When the applause resurfaced, a facilities supervisor I knew by name approached carrying a clipboard and a sealed envelope. "Ms. Cooper," he said quietly, "I was instructed to deliver this directly." The envelope bore our family office letterhead and my mother's assistant's signature line. I opened it at once. The text was short, formal, and immediate. Effective pending review. My archive room credentials were suspended. Requests for estate materials were to route through acting executor counsel. No cause listed, only process language and a reference number. I signed the delivery receipt, wrote the time beside my signature, and asked, "Who issued the instruction?" He hesitated, then answered in a lower voice. "I received it from Ms. Pierce in Family Office Operations, 32 minutes ago." He glanced toward the stage. "I'm sorry." "Thank you for documenting service," I said. That was restraint too. Not forgiveness, not passivity, just refusal to give them the spectacle that would cleanse what they were doing. The crowd began to break into small constellations around donor tables. I turned toward the corridor leading to the parking mezzanine, intending to leave before someone assigned me another ceremonial invisibility. I had reached the security gate when I heard Dalton behind me. "Avery." I stopped and faced him. Up close, his expression carried strain that never reached his voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Mother is trying to keep order." "Order," I repeated. He exhaled, glancing toward the atrium where our mother stood with trustees. "You know how these transitions work. Public confidence matters. If you challenge this in public, you hurt everyone." "Everyone," I said again, and met his eyes long enough for him to understand that I heard the plea and the threat inside the same sentence. He lowered his voice. "Take your personal bequest. Let this go." My pulse was loud in my ears, but my words came out level. "I will respond through counsel." He looked almost relieved, as if a script had resumed. "Good, that's best." "Best for whom?" went unsaid. He turned back toward the atrium before I moved, already absorbed by the current pulling him towards centre stage. At the security gate, my badge flashed red. The guard on duty, a former Coast Guard petty officer named Franklin who had worked our building for 9 years, frowned at his monitor and tried again. Red. He straightened when he recognized me and lowered his voice. "I just received a restriction notice tied to estate assets. I can escort you to retrieve personal items later if approved. Please note the time and system message code in your incident log," I said. He nodded once. "Already done. Thank you." I signed the temporary exit record with the pen chained to the desk, then paused as 2 trustees passed behind me discussing stability optics. One said, not quietly enough, "Avery always took things personally." The other answered, "Some people are built for support functions." Their shoes clicked across waxed stone and kept going. I stood there for a moment with my hand still on the logbook, feeling anger press upward like heat against a sealed lid. The old reflex was to explain myself until someone conceded fairness. The newer discipline was colder and more reliable. Do not seek acknowledgement from people who benefit from your diminishment. Seek records. Build sequence. Move. Outside, evening had turned the glass facade into a mirror. My reflection looked composed enough to satisfy any camera. Shoulders square, jaw set, eyes dry. The city traffic below sounded remote, filtered through concrete and height. I stepped to the curb where rideshare vehicles lined up under the porte cochere and took out my phone. 3 unread messages were already waiting. One from my mother's assistant reiterating the credential suspension, one from corporate counsel requesting cooperative alignment, and one from an unknown number containing only a photograph of my father's old navy leather document tube on what looked like a courthouse metal table. No caption, no greeting, just the tube and a visible corner of a chain of custody form. I did not reply. Not yet. I enlarged the image and read what I could from the seal impression near the cap. A registry code ending in 7V, not the suffix listed on the will filed that afternoon. My throat tightened, not with panic but with recognition. There it was again, the same fracture in their certainty I had seen in ledger margins and transmission logs, small enough to dismiss, durable enough to survive them. Behind me, the lobby doors opened and closed, releasing bursts of laughter from people congratulating one another on continuity. I put the phone back in my coat pocket, lifted my hand to hail the next car, and chose the only response that had ever protected me in rooms built to erase me. Restraint first, record second, action on the record. I left without looking back, not because I was finished, but because I had finally learned the difference between being dismissed and being defeated. I raised my hand, and the third car in line eased toward the curb with its headlights skimming the wet stone. The driver lowered the rear window and confirmed my name from his app. I gave him an address I had not planned to speak 10 seconds earlier. District Probate Records Annex, East Intake Entrance. He glanced at me in the mirror, surprised at the destination and the hour, then nodded and pulled into traffic. The city moved past in metallic fragments, glass towers cut into ribbons by the rain, brake lights smearing red across the windshield. I opened the unknown message again and enlarged the photograph until the image pixelated at the edge of the seal. My father's navy leather document tube lay on a grey steel table. The cap turned 3/4 of a rotation, the old initials stamped in fading gold, RC. The chain of custody form in the corner carried partial print I could barely read, but one line was clear enough to hold, receiving clerk E. Voss. My mother had told me for months that the tube had contained obsolete marina permits and decommissioned loan drafts, nothing relevant, nothing worth preserving. She had said it in that patient tone she reserved for statements that were not meant to be questioned, and every time I had asked to review it, she had redirected me to someone who suddenly couldn't locate the key. The rhythm of the tires over bridge seams brought back another room, another table, another correction disguised as family instruction. I had been 16, still narrow-shouldered, still learning which silences cost less. My father had assigned me to reconcile quarter-end fuel invoices for the Harbour Division because Dalton had skipped 2 deadlines and blamed software migration. I worked through 3 nights at the kitchen counter under a brass pendant light while my mother hosted donors in the next room. I could hear Crystal touching Crystal, her laugh lifting at intervals, the cadence she used when she wanted men in blazers to feel both important and needed. At 9:30 on the second night, she stepped into the kitchen, looked at the stacks of ledgers and said, "Avery, wipe this table. Guests will pass through." I told her I was tracing duplicate vendor IDs against transfer logs. She smiled as if I had proven her point. "Exactly. You're useful with detail work." Then she turned, called Dalton in from the hall and said loudly enough for the guests to hear, "Come greet everyone. You should be seen." It had continued in variations for years, each one small enough to survive challenge, each one precise enough to accumulate force. At 23, at the charity regatta dinner, my mother introduced me to a retired admiral as our practical daughter, excellent support staff in any emergency. I remembered the admiral's polite nod, his hand already moving to Dalton's shoulder before mine had dropped to my side. I remembered smiling because there were cameras and because my father was watching from 2 tables away with the expression he wore when he sensed fault lines, but chose not to redraw them in public. At 26, during the compliance panic that threatened our freight subsidiary, I built the stabilization matrix, negotiated waiver windows, and prepared the board's disclosure sequence in 48 hours. The board chair thanked Dalton in the official minutes for steady leadership under stress. I received an internal memo addressed to A. Cooper, Administrative Support. When I corrected the record with attachments, I was told by corporate counsel that title sensitivity during bereavement transition is not constructive. We stopped at a light near the Veterans Hall where my father's memorial had been held 3 weeks earlier. The sightline through the rain drew the memory up intact. White gloves, flag case, polished wood, and my mother at the receiving line deciding who counted as public grief and who counted as logistics. "Stand near registration," she had told me as attendees entered. "We need someone managing flow." I asked if I would stand with family for the line after the invocation. She adjusted her black cuff and answered without looking at me. "We need dignity today, Avery. Do not create confusion." I had watched cousins, board members, and distant political acquaintances pass my station and offer condolences to my mother and Dalton while I handed out service cards and directed wheelchairs down the side aisle. One widow in her 70s, a woman who had served with my father's first command, paused and took my hand. "You're his daughter," she said quietly. I nodded. She squeezed once and moved on. No one in my family acknowledged the exchange. By the end of that afternoon, I had memorized the choreography of being present and uncounted. The car turned onto East Mercer and slowed beside a concrete building with recessed windows and a state seal bolted above the door. The records annex was not built for ceremony. Fluorescent spill washed the entry stairs in a hard white gradient, and a security camera tracked the curb in slow mechanical arcs. I paid, stepped out, and felt cold rain bead immediately along my coat collar. As I reached the awning, my phone lit with a second message from the same unknown number. "Ask for intake supervisor L. Moreno. Reference code 7V-RC. Come alone. No signature, still no greeting." Inside, the lobby smelled of damp paper and machine toner. A metal detector framed a narrow corridor lined with framed notices about archival handling and evidentiary sanctions. The guard on duty checked my identification and scanned the message on my screen without comment. "Intake is still open for sealed submissions," he said. "Third window." His tone carried the neutrality of people who have seen too many families at their least honest. Supervisor Lena Moreno stood behind tempered glass at window 3. Grey hair pinned in a low twist, glasses on a chain resting against a navy cardigan, with the county seal embroidered over the pocket. She looked from my face to my ID, and then to the code I wrote on the visitor slip. "Ms. Cooper," she said, voice low. "You were expected." "By whom?" She slid a clipboard toward me through the slot. "Sign acknowledgement of restricted viewing. You are not authorized to remove items, only to identify and request preservation." She waited until I signed and timestamped. "Receiving clerk Eleanor Voss logged an emergency deposit from private custody 40 minutes ago. The depositor requested chain integrity pending court authentication." The name settled into place with the certainty of a lock catching. E. Voss from the form corner. Not rumour, not family commentary, an actual custody transfer. "I need to see the item," I said. Moreno pressed a button. A side door released with a magnetic click, and a records technician in latex gloves met me in a narrow viewing room, separated from intake by another pane of glass. The room held a stainless counter, 2 overhead cameras, and an evidence lamp angled downward like an interrogation tool. He placed a clear archival box on the counter and stepped back. Inside lay the navy leather tube from the photograph. Up close, it looked older than I remembered, the leather darkened at the seams, one edge burnished smooth where my father's thumb used to rest when he carried it to board meetings. The brass collar near the cap bore a notarial embossing partially obscured by age, but the last 2 characters were clear under the lamp. 7V. A cream tag tied to the strap listed intake details and provisional classification. Testamentary instrument package. Contested estate. My pulse shifted from heat to focus. Moreno's voice came through an intercom speaker. "Do you identify this item as a personal family storage object tied to decedent Richard Cooper?" "Yes," I said. "Originating from his private lockbox, west study cabinet, upper shelf. Last personally observed by me 8 months before death. State basis. Initial stamp RC. Custom bridle leather with repaired lower seam. Brass collar engraving with registry suffix. There is a nick on the left cap ridge from a dropped drafting weight." The technician rotated the tube with gloved fingers. The nick appeared exactly where memory placed it. Narrow crescent, old and pale. "Identification accepted for record," Moreno said. "Do you request immediate preservation hold and duplication restraint?" "Yes, full hold. No destructive testing. Chain of custody disclosure to all counsel of record." She keyed notes into her terminal. Request entered at 19:26 hours. A second box came in then, smaller, containing a folded chain log and an outer sleeve that had once wrapped the tube. Across the sleeve, in my father's handwriting, was a line I had seen only once before in ledger margin shorthand and had been told was meaningless. Revised copy with EV after incident review. Seeing it on physical paper changed its legal weight from inference to fact. I heard my own breath in the room and then forced it steady. I need certified copies of the intake log, depositor affidavit, and custody transfer timestamps. Moreno answered immediately. Affidavit remains sealed pending judicial directive. Log extract is releasable. Copies in 15 minutes. While the technician returned the boxes to secured transport, I stood under the fluorescent lamp and let one more layer of history settle where it belonged. The last year of my father's life had included strange, controlled interruptions that had seemed unrelated until now. Medication blister packs arriving with altered refill dates, signature appointments rescheduled without his confirmation, household staff told to route legal mail through my mother's office for efficiency. When I asked questions then, I was told grief had made me suspicious. When I logged irregularities, I was told I lacked context. When I requested independent review, I was told real successors did not need to prove themselves. Each dismissal had been framed as concern, as protection, as order. Under glass at the annex, order looked different. Order had sequence, custody, suffix codes, signatures that could be compared under magnification. Order did not need my mother's permission. By the first week of October, I had already started dating every irregular entry in my father's medication and signature calendar against board actions and trust amendments, because pattern is easier to deny when events stay isolated. Tonight, that pattern gained an anchor object no one could wave away as my interpretation. The tube existed. It was logged. It was tagged to testamentary instruments. It was tied to Eleanor Voss by name. Moreno handed me a stamped packet through the slot at exactly 1941, each page clipped, each line item legible. You may file emergency motion for preservation and authentication before midnight if you intend to seek expedited hearing, she said. I intend to, I answered. She held my gaze for a brief second that did not break neutrality but acknowledge stakes. Then, do not discuss this in hallways. I won't. Outside, rain had thinned to a fine mist that silvered the annex steps. I stood under the awning and called my litigation associate, Nora Ellison, from my direct line. She answered on the second ring. Avery? Open the district e-filing portal, I said. We are submitting an emergency preservation motion tonight. New evidence in county custody, reference code 7V-RC. I need judge assignment protocol and nearest available hearing slot. A beat of silence, then the rustle of paper and keyboard clicks. Understood. Are you safe to speak details? Limited details only. I'll send stamped logs and identification statement in 6 minutes. Mark everything privileged, litigation hold immediate. Done. I'm in. I ended the call and sent encrypted scans from the packet before my hands could start shaking from delayed adrenaline. Then I made one more call, this one mandatory by statute, once contested testamentary evidence entered county custody. Notice to Counsel of Record. Opposing counsel's voicemail took my message in a polished, automated tone. This is Avery Cooper, beneficiary and interested party in the estate of Richard Cooper. Formal notice, new evidentiary item tied to testamentary instruments deposited at District Probate Records Annex, preservation hold requested and logged at 1926. Written notice and reference documentation will follow through filing portal tonight. I disconnected, documented the call outcome in my notes, and photographed the annex clock for timestamp corroboration. No raised voice, no accusations, no speech about betrayal under rain and sodium light. Just sequence, just record. Just the disciplined transfer of a private wound into admissible fact. For the first time since the conference room, my absence from their frame no longer mattered, because the case had acquired an object that could stand in any room without me and still tell the truth. My phone vibrated again before I stepped away from the awning, a sharp pulse against my palm that felt almost mechanical after the fluorescent hush inside. The sender was Family Office Operations, copied to Corporate Counsel and the acting executor address now controlled by Dalton's team. The message was formal, immediate, and designed to look procedural. Unauthorized contact with county repositories may constitute interference with estate administration. All inquiries must route through executor counsel. Direct outreach to records personnel is prohibited pending internal review. I read it once, then a second time, and saved the header metadata before forwarding it to Nora with one line: add to pressure timeline. The curb was slick with mist, cars hissing past, courthouse lights flattening every colour into silver and slate. Behind me, the annex door opened long enough for a clerk to wheel out 2 locked bins. He did not look at me. Institutions train people to protect process first, people second, and families like mine survive by hiding intent inside that reflex. Nora called before I could request another car. "Portal is open," she said, already moving. I could hear keyboard strokes and the clipped voices of 2 associates in the background. "We have a non-trivial problem. Opposing counsel filed an hour ago to designate you as a non-party emotional claimant for emergency motion purposes. They're arguing only the acting executor has standing to request expedited authentication. On what basis? Administrative continuity and anti-harassment doctrine. It's thin, but it can slow us." "It can slow us," I said, "if we accept their framing." "I know. Come to the litigation suite. We'll file with statutory standing and direct injury." I gave the driver our downtown office address and watched the annex recede in the rear window, county seals shrinking to a pale coin in the rain. By the time we reached Franklin Street, it was just after 8:30 and the tower lobby had shifted into its night posture. Half the lights dimmed, security desk reinforced, cleaning carts lined like parked equipment along the wall. My badge still opened our floor, but only after a guard called upstairs to verify. Another note for the record. Another gate that had never existed before. My father died. Inside our suite, the conference room smelled like toner, stale coffee, and overheated electronics. Nora stood at the head of the table in shirt sleeves, reading from a marked-up draft while 2 junior associates assembled exhibits in numbered folders. At the far end sat Victor Hale, the outside probate consultant our firm had retained for courtroom logistics, a former clerk with immaculate credentials and a habit of speaking to me as though I were a difficult witness in my own matter. He looked up when I entered and gave the kind of polite nod men use before narrowing your role. "We've structured this as counsel-driven," he said. "Given your personal stake, it is strategically cleaner if you remain silent in court unless asked a direct factual question." I set my wet coat over a chair and placed the stamped annex packet on the table. "I am the factual witness for identification and sequence." "Emotionally, yes," he said, not unkindly, which made it worse. "Legally, the judge will prefer neutral voices." Nora did not look up from the draft. "The judge will prefer admissible facts." Victor exhaled through his nose, then tapped the caption page with one finger. "If Ms. Cooper speaks at length, opposing counsel will characterize this as family grievance theatre. We should avoid that paradigm." I opened the packet, slid the custody log under the table light, and read aloud the intake line. Timestamp, receiving clerk, classification code, and hold request in one uninterrupted cadence. Then I recited the statutory provision for interested parties standing from memory, subsection, and commentary note, including the appellate language clarifying that executor conflict is itself grounds for direct petition by a named beneficiary where testamentary integrity is at risk. By the time I finished, the room had gone still, except for the hum of the air handler. Victor blinked once. "You've litigated this section before." "3 times, I said. 2 published orders." He leaned back, recalibrating. "Then keep your answers narrow and technical." Agreed. That should have closed the matter. It did not. 10 minutes later, while Nora coordinated e-signatures, one of our own junior associates quietly moved my chair 2 places down the table and placed a yellow sticky note at the head seat for Victor. No malice, just instinctive hierarchy. Consultant-centered. Beneficiary displaced. I moved the chair back without comment and continued indexing exhibits. Small corrections matter because they predict larger ones. At 9:07 p.m, opposing counsel returned my statutory notice call with the speakerphone on in his office, his tone warm enough to sound cooperative if no one listened for content. "Ms. Cooper," he said, "we received your voicemail. Out of respect for your bereavement, I'll be direct. You are not authorized to initiate evidentiary escalations. Please allow trained fiduciary officers to manage these matters." Nora muted our room and mouthed, "Keep him talking." I answered, "Notice has been served. Filing will proceed." A brief pause, then the softened blade. If you continue unilateral contact with county staff, we may seek protective restrictions for disruptive conduct. On what record? On the record your behaviour creates. He ended the call before I could respond. Nora unmuted and said, "We file that transcript summary as intimidation pattern." "Do it," I said. By 9:40 we had uploaded the emergency motion, custody logs, identification declaration, and request for immediate authentication hearing. The portal rejected the submission twice under an access flag I had never seen: filer relationship mismatch, estate-level restriction. Nora swore under her breath once, then corrected herself and started a manual override request. Victor suggested waiting until morning, when administrative staff are fully awake, as though delay were neutral. I looked at the wall clock, then at the rejection code, and felt the underlying architecture clearly. Exclusion was no longer social theatre, it had become permissions management. "We file hard copy with duty clerk," I said. Nora nodded before Victor could object. "Grab coats." The night intake desk at District Probate Court sat behind reinforced glass under lights too bright for the hour. A sign taped to the counter read, "Emergency filings. Counsel of record, only unless ordered." The clerk on duty, a tired man with reading glasses and a county badge clipped crookedly to his lapel, scanned our packet and stopped at my declaration page. "Only executor submissions can trigger estate authentication at this stage," he said. "That's standard." "It is common," I answered. "Not absolute. Conflict exception applies." He shook his head. "I can stamp receive, but not route to duty judge without proper filer class." Nora stepped in. "Counsel of record is present. Wrote under contested testamentary integrity." The clerk hesitated, then looked past Nora to me. "Are you counsel?" "No." "Then I need you to wait behind the line while counsel handles intake." He pointed to a strip of red tape on the floor. 3 feet of distance, symbolic and enforceable. I stepped back because arguing with intake staff wastes time, and because humiliation has always arrived in my life disguised as policy. While Nora and Victor worked the counter, I stood behind the tape and watched a custodian mop rainwater from the entry tiles in slow arcs. A television mounted in the corner played muted weather coverage. Somewhere down the hall, a copy machine jammed and beeped until someone struck it silent. 20 minutes passed before the clerk returned our packet unstamped. "Duty judge requests in-person clarification. Chambers Annex, room C12, counsel and principal declarant only." He looked at Nora. "Consultant not needed." Victor's jaw tightened. He gathered his briefcase and said nothing as we left him at the corridor turn. Exclusion changes direction quickly once authority starts moving. Chambers Annex smelled of old carpet, legal pads and burnt coffee. The duty judge was not on the bench. She appeared by secure video from home, her image crisp on a wall monitor, robe collar visible above a dark sweater. Judge Harlan listened while Nora outlined our request, then interrupted with 2 precise questions about chain of custody and depositor identity. I answered both from the log. Opposing counsel joined remotely 5 minutes later, voice sharper than before. "Your Honour, this is a grief-driven fishing expedition by a beneficiary dissatisfied with lawful succession." Judge Harlan glanced down at her screen. "Counsel, I have reviewed your filing. I asked for facts, not adjectives." He shifted tactics. "Then facts. No authenticated alternative instrument has been produced." Before Nora could respond, the chamber door opened behind us. A clerk entered carrying a sealed pouch and a slim woman in a charcoal coat with reins still on the shoulders. She removed leather gloves with deliberate care, then offered identification to the clerk without looking at anyone else. "Notary Elena Voss," she said. Her voice was low, clear, and entirely unhurried. "I am here on the court's request regarding registry suffix 7 Victor and emergency custody transfer from private hold." The air in the room seemed to contract around that sentence. On the monitor, opposing counsel stopped mid-breath. Judge Harlan straightened. "Ms. Voss, are you prepared to state your role for this record?" "I am," she said. "I supervised execution and dual witness attestation of a testamentary amendment for Richard Cooper 6 months after the instrument currently filed by acting executor parties. I retained contingency custody instructions triggered by incident review findings. Tonight I initiated deposit compliance through county intake." No one moved for a full second. Then opposing counsel found his voice. "Your Honour, We object to unsworn narrative. Judge Harlan cut him off. You may object after she is sworn. Eleanor Voss turned then, finally, and looked directly at me. Recognition did not arrive as comfort, it arrived as professional confirmation. Ms. Cooper, she said with formal precision, you requested the correct preservation protocol. Thank you for keeping sequence. It was the first time in weeks that anyone in a position of legal authority had addressed my actions as competent rather than disruptive. Not daughter, not practical support, not emotional claimant. Ms. Cooper. Correct protocol, sequence. The clerk administered oath. Voss signed preliminary verification under camera, then placed the sealed pouch on the evidence tray with both hands visible, chain tag facing forward. She stated intake times, private custody intervals, witness identifiers, and the exact trigger language my father had selected for release if coercive interference indicators emerged around medications or signature scheduling. Each line tightened the framework around the truth I had been building from fragments. This was no longer one beneficiary's suspicion. It was a notarial chain with documentary gravity. Judge Harlan issued oral directives in clipped succession. Emergency hold affirmed. All testamentary instruments under dispute to be authenticated on expedited schedule. No transfer of contested governance powers pending review. Sanctions warning to any party attempting contact restrictions outside court order. She set continued hearing for first call the next morning and required personal appearance of executor parties. As the video feed ended, opposing counsel disconnected without farewell. Nora closed her notebook slowly, as if sudden movement might break what had just been established. In the hallway outside C12, fluorescent light flattened us into pale outlines against institutional beige. Eleanor Voss replaced her gloves, then handed me a business card with only her name, commission number, and a secure service address. I do not discuss substance in corridors, she said, but you should sleep if you can. I can't, I said. Then breathe on purpose, she replied. Precision requires oxygen. She walked toward the Clark station without looking back. Nora touched my sleeve once, brief and practical. We're on record now, she said. They can't bury this in email language anymore. It was nearly midnight when we reached the courthouse exit. Rain reduced to a cold drift that made the stone steps shine. I paused under the awning and opened my notes, adding the final entries while details were still exact. Call returned, threat phrasing, portal rejection codes, red tape line at intake, appearance of notary Eleanor Voss, oath administered, directives issued. Across the street, the flag over the civic building hung heavy in the damp air, barely moving. My mother had spent years teaching rooms to see me as a function, never an authority. Tonight, in a chamber built for hierarchy, a credible witness had named my method in the language that mattered. The pressure had not lifted, it had changed shape. For the first time since my father's funeral, the record and my voice were no longer running on parallel tracks. They had converged. Nora waited while I finished the last line in my notebook, the ink spreading slightly where mist touched the page, then took the pad from my hand long enough to tear out a clean sheet for service copies. We should move now, she said. If they file overnight to limit scope, we need first position at calendar call. I nodded, and we crossed back through the security doors to the Clark station where the night deputy stamped our emergency order packet for certified distribution. Opposing counsel had tried to keep me outside the red tape line an hour earlier. Now the same deputy addressed me by name and slid the sealed envelope toward me with both hands. Procedure had not become kinder. It had become accountable. By 12:34 a.m., we were in the copy room 3 floors above intake, fluorescent light flattening every face into sleepless concentration, while the machine fed out certified sets with the county watermark visible at the bottom margin. Nora handled electronic service. I handled physical routing because couriers still move faster than assumptions in contested estates. I called the bonded runner we used for injunctions, gave him 3 addresses and filing class priority, and made him read each one back. He arrived 40 minutes later in a rain jacket, signed the chain sheet, and left with the packets in a locked case. External contact logged, dispatch verified, delivery receipts pending. No speeches, no strategic grandstanding, only controlled sequence. At 1:22 a.m., Marianne's counsel sent an email objection marked urgent, asking the court to strike Eleanor Voss's statements as irregular and to seal all references to alleged coercion indicators. until full evidentiary hearing. Nora printed it, highlighted the timing, and drafted a 2-page response citing the judge's oral directives from chambers. I added 1 paragraph of factual correction, exact and narrow. The notary had appeared at the court's request, oath administered on record, chain tag entered under clerk supervision. We filed by 1:49. At 2:03, the docket updated. Objection received, no immediate relief granted. The screen refreshed once, then settled. They had moved. We had answered. Nothing about it felt triumphant. It felt like holding a line in crosswind. When we finally stepped into the parking level, the rain had stopped and left a thin chemical sheen over the concrete. Nora leaned against her car door and looked at me with the blunt concern of someone who knows endurance has a cost. "You can come to my place for 3 hours," she said. "Shower, tea, alarm at 6. I shook my head. "I need my own desk before court." She did not argue, only handed me a protein bar from her bag and said, "Then eat while you print your direct chronology. If they force narrative drift, we anchor with time." I promised I would. She drove out first. I sat in my car for a full minute with the engine off, palms on the steering wheel, practicing the kind of breathing Eleanor Voss had prescribed in the hallway. Precision requires oxygen. My apartment was dark and orderly in the way spaces become when work replaces living. I set my coat over a chair, opened my laptop, and built a single-page chronology from funeral week to midnight filing. Each entry, 1 line. Who acted, what instrument, when logged, where preserved. I attached the annex intake extract, the hold request, the call notice transcript summary, the portal rejection codes, the duty order. At 3:11 a.m., Franklin from Building Security returned the message I had left him earlier about badge restriction history. "Ms. Cooper," he said, voice rough with fatigue, "I pulled the system audit. Restriction command entered at 4:10 p.m. yesterday from Family Office Operations Terminal. User ID tied to Marianne Cooper's credentials." I thanked him, asked permission to list him as custodian witness, and he agreed. Another external contact resolved, another timestamp secured. At 6:42, courthouse dawn looked like brushed steel. The front steps were still damp, the flag above the civic block moving in short, reluctant folds. Media had not assembled in force, but 2 legal reporters stood near the side rail with notebooks and courthouse badges, watching who entered with whom. Inside, the security line moved in clipped silence under signs about prohibited electronics and contempt penalties. I placed my notebook, files, and phone in a grey tray, walked through the scanner, and felt the ordinary indignity of being asked to raise my arms while men who had called me disruptive passed on familiar nods. In legal buildings, hierarchy is often visible in who gets waved through. Courtroom 4B carried the same municipal austerity as every contested probate room I had ever worked. Waxed floors, pale wood, state seal above the bench, clocks that run 2 minutes fast, and fluorescent panels that make everyone look slightly unwell. Marianne sat at counsel table in matte black, posture perfect, jaw set so tightly a pulse moved at her temple. Dalton sat to her left, tie reknotted too high, eyes fixed on the exhibit monitor, as if concentration alone could hold the morning in place. When I entered with Nora, Marianne did not greet me. She adjusted a legal pad so its edge aligned exactly with the table seam. That had always been her tell when control thinned. Calendar call began at 8:11 a.m. 3 landlord-tenant matters cleared first, then an adoption finalisation that briefly changed the room's temperature, then our case. Estate of Richard Cooper, contested testamentary instruments, and executor authority review, the clerk announced. Judge Harlan took the bench without preamble. Appearances. Names entered the record in order. When mine came, I stated them cleanly. Avery Elaine Cooper, interested party and designated beneficiary under disputed instruments, present with counsel Nora Ellison. No one corrected my standing this time. Opposing counsel moved first, pressing for delay and sealed review, characterizing the second instrument as procedurally suspect and emotionally weaponized. He spoke in long, polished clauses about family distress, reputational risk, and the need for orderly stewardship pending authentication. Then Judge Harlan turned to Nora. Response. Nora rose, cited the overnight filings, and asked for immediate evidentiary handling of the sealed pouch, chain logs, and witness attestation. We are not asking the court to infer intent, she said. We are asking the court to read executed documents under oath. Eleanor Voss was called before either side could extend argument into theatre. She stepped to the witness stand in the same charcoal coat, hair still pinned, commission badge clipped inside her folder. Under oath, she identified her notarial registry, training, and the dual witness protocol she used for high-risk testamentary amendments. She confirmed she had supervised execution of a second will 6 months after the instrument filed by acting executor parties. She identified the leather tube, the chain log, and the contingency release instructions signed by my father in her presence and countersigned by 2 witnesses whose affidavits were sealed, pending this hearing. Opposing counsel attempted to narrow her to technicalities. Ms. Voss, is it your testimony that you personally diagnosed coercion? No, she said. I testified that the decedent reported coercive pressure regarding medication timing and signature scheduling, and that I documented his request for contingency release if interference indicators persisted. Reported by him, not verified by you. Verified in part by irregular appointment records and witness observation notes attached to the affidavit package. Objection? Narrative, counsel for Marianne said. Judge Harland overruled. The witness may complete factual foundation. Eleanor continued unhurried. The second instrument contains explicit revocation language for prior dispositive provisions, inconsistent with amended governance control. It preserves specified personal bequests, including one to Dalton Pierce Cooper. It removes executor authority from Marianne Cooper and appoints successor administrative control to Avery Elaine Cooper under supervised trust terms. The sentence landed with the force of metal on stone, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise. Judge Harland requested the sealed packet. The clerk carried it to the bench, broke the seal on camera, and passed copies to both counsel tables. Pages turned across the room in a dry, synchronized sound. I watched Marianne's hand on the margin of page 2. Her fingers whitened at the knuckles, then trembled once and stilled. Dalton scanned forward too quickly, then back, as if trying to locate a different outcome between clauses. There was none. The judge read for several minutes in silence, then asked 2 verification questions about witness identities and execution date. Eleanor answered both. The clerk confirmed registry match. The court's document examiner, already on standby from the overnight order, gave a preliminary authenticity statement from the side podium. Signature characteristics consistent pending full report. Paper stock, seal impression, and notarization index aligned with period records. No immediate indicator of fabrication. Opposing counsel asked to voir dire the examiner and gained nothing except another confirmation of chain integrity. Then the reversal came. Brief and public, exactly in the register law allows. On the record before me, Judge Harland said, the court admits the second testamentary instrument for probate purposes pending final authentication report. Prior executor authority vested in Marianne Cooper is suspended effective immediately for material non-disclosure risk. Controlling governance rights and administrative authority transfer to Avery Elaine Cooper under interim supervised trust oversight. Personal bequests not in conflict remain preserved, including the bequest to Dalton Pierce Cooper. No contested asset actions may proceed without Ms. Cooper's signed authorization and court notice. She looked directly at me. Ms. Cooper, are you prepared to assume administration immediately? Yes, Your Honor. State clearly. Yes, I am prepared to assume administration immediately. Then approach after recess for fiduciary acknowledgement. It was done in under 3 minutes. No raised voices, no cinematic pause, no permission requested from the people who had spent years deciding where I could stand. The clerk entered orders while the judge moved to the next matter. Law had no interest in my history unless attached to evidence. Now it was attached, and the room had to live inside that fact. The aftershock began before we even sat down. Marianne reached for her water, missed the glass once, found it on the second attempt, and set it back untouched. Colour had drained from her face in a slow, unmistakable wash. Not theatrical faintness, but the visible mathematics of a plan collapsing in public. She leaned toward her counsel and whispered with clipped urgency I could not hear, then louder, "File immediate objection. We request stay. We request sealed implementation." Counsel kept his voice low. "We can request. It is unlikely." Dalton did not speak for almost a full minute. He stared at the admitted copy in front of him, then at me, then down again, jaw moving once as if he were trying to form a sentence that would preserve his place in a structure that no longer existed. Finally, he said, barely above a whisper, "I didn't know about this." It was not addressed to the court, it was addressed to the table, to the heir, to anyone who could still classify him as beneficiary rather than architect. The distinction was in the order, and that distinction kept him from total ruin, but it did not restore authority. Across the aisle, two trustees who had toasted continuity in the glass lobby the day before now sat very still, eyes on their legal pads, avoiding one another's gaze. One of them coughed into his fist and asked his counsel whether prior board notices were now defective. The answer came back flat. Potentially all of them. A reporter in the back row wrote without looking up. The other reporter closed her notebook, reopened it, and underlined a line twice. In reputational systems, silence can be louder than applause. This was that silence, thick and fluorescent. When recess was called, Marianne stood too quickly, steadied herself on the table edge, and turned toward me with that same curated composure she had worn at donor dinners and memorial lines. For a second I thought she would speak in the old register, order, stability, family optics, but nothing came out. Her mouth opened, closed, and set into a narrow line. Counsel touched her sleeve and guided her toward the side conference room, reserved for contested parties. She went without looking back. I stayed where I was until the aisle cleared, then walked to the clerk's station for fiduciary acknowledgement. The form was longer than most people expect. Duty of loyalty, duty of care, disclosure obligations, sanctions for concealment, penalties for self-dealing. I read each paragraph before signing because signatures are where sovereignty becomes enforceable. The clerk notarized, stamped, and handed me the conformed copy, while the courtroom noise resumed around us. Ordinary cases reclaiming the docket, as if families did not fracture in these seats every day. Nora stood beside me as I slid the copy into my folder. "You kept it exact," she said quietly. "I kept it on the record," I answered. At counsel table behind us, Dalton was still seated, shoulders rounded now, speaking in low, urgent fragments to his attorney about personal bequest language and whether he needed separate representation. Marianne remained in the conference room with the door closed. Through the narrow wired glass panel, I could see only the outline of her profile and one hand pressed flat against the table, motionless. The room had not become merciful. It had become clear, and clarity was enough. The clerk had just handed me the conformed fiduciary acknowledgement when the side door opened and Elena Voss stepped out with Lena Moreno beside her, both of them carrying sealed transfer satchels with county tags. Moreno's cardigan was unchanged from intake, but she now wore a witness sticker on her lapel, and she met my eyes with the same careful neutrality she had used behind glass. "Ms. Cooper," she said, "for chain continuity, the leather tube, outer sleeve, and intake log extracts are being moved from provisional storage to the court evidence vault under Judge Harlan's oral order. You will receive custody status, not possession." She held out a carbon copy receipt. I signed on the indicated line, time-stamped it, and watched her countersign before the satchels left my sight. I turned to Elena. "The unknown messages last night, were those from you?" "From a court relay account routed through intake," she said. "I was barred from direct beneficiary contact until deposit cleared. You were the only party who had flagged the suffix correctly, so I used code only." She adjusted her gloves and added, "No further anonymous contact is pending. Anything else comes through counsel." That thread, at least, closed cleanly. When court reconvened, the fluorescent glare seemed even harsher, as if the room had no interest in easing anyone into consequence. Opposing counsel rose immediately to request a stay sealed implementation and temporary reinstatement of Marianne's executor powers to avoid disruption. Judge Harlan did not raise her voice. Request denied. Disruption came from non-disclosure. She looked at the clerk. "Enter interim directives now." The directives came one after another with the clipped force of procedural language that cannot be argued into kindness. The second will, the navy leather tube, the handwritten sleeve marked revised copy with E-fee, and the dual witness packet were admitted as protected evidence pending final examiner report. Non-destructive authentication only, exactly as requested. Chain of custody logs from county intake were incorporated into the record. The portal rejection codes and filer mismatch flags were preserved for technical review by Court IT, with a written report due in 10 days. Family Office Operations was ordered to rescind all access restrictions issued after my father's death unless specifically authorized by court order. My suspended archive credentials, badge blocks, and repository limits were voided on the record. Then Judge Harland addressed the coercion indicators directly. "This court is not making criminal findings today," she said, each word measured, "but medication schedule interference and manipulated signature access are material to testamentary integrity. All related calendars, refill records, household routing logs, and appointment communications are to be preserved immediately. Any destruction will trigger sanctions referral." She turned toward Marianne. "Do you understand?" My mother stood. Her voice emerged thin but formal. "I understand the words, Your Honour. I dispute the characterization." "You may dispute at evidentiary hearing," the judge said. "For now, comply." Nora handed me a note while the clerk typed. "Courier receipts arriving downstairs. External service completed." I nodded once and folded the paper into my file. Dalton asked to be heard through separate counsel, and for a moment the room shifted from accusation to sorting. He did not look at me when he spoke. "I request clarification that my personal bequest remains intact and that I am not being found to have orchestrated document suppression." Judge Harland confirmed both points in plain terms. His bequest remained preserved. He was removed from contested fiduciary authority. No finding of orchestration at this stage. Dalton sat down slowly, shoulders lowered by something heavier than defeat. In the silence after, he leaned toward me without crossing the aisle and said, barely audible, "The day at the security gate, when I told you to let it go, I repeated what she told me to say. I did not know about the second instrument." He waited as if expecting absolution. "You were beneficiary, not architect," I said, using the court's language because it was the only language that did not ask me to rewrite history. He nodded once. That was all. Marianne's loaded silences did not turn into confession. When her counsel prompted, she gave narrow answers, each one engineered to minimize intent. Yes, she authorized the archive suspension. Yes, she approved the credential restriction email from her user, ID. Yes, she instructed communications staff to use immediate airs in public materials. No, she did not consider those actions retaliatory. The look she had given me in the lobby, the one that had always meant fall in line, never paid off into revelation. It remained what it had always been. Control without admission. By noon, certified implementation orders were ready at the Clark station. I signed for 3 court packets, 1 trustee service set, and 1 corporate governance notice stamped urgent. In the hallway, the 2 legal reporters who had watched Calendar Call approached with notebooks closed, tone professional. "Ms. Cooper, 1 attribution line?" the older one asked. "How do you characterize today's ruling?" I answered without stopping. "Administrative correction through authenticated evidence." No one could turn that into spectacle. At the security desk on the first floor, Franklin was waiting with a sealed envelope and his incident log excerpt clipped behind it. He straightened when he saw me and kept his voice low. "Per court directive, your building access is restored. I also prepared the audit statement you requested." He tapped the second page. "Restriction command entered 4:10 p.m. Family Office Operations Terminal. User credential matching Marianne Cooper. I included system message code and my verification steps." "Did anyone pressure you to alter it?" I asked. He held my gaze. 2 calls this morning asking for a clean summary," I declined. "Document stands." "Thank you, Franklin." He gave a brief nod that looked almost like relief. External contact resolved. I went straight from the courthouse to Cooper House with a process server, a trustee liaison, and a court IT contractor because the order required same-day compliance. The West Study smelled like old wood polish and stale lilies from the funeral arrangements nobody had removed. Marianne stood near the desk when we entered, one hand on the chair back, watching the liaison read each directive aloud. Archive room access reinstated. All estate records to remain on site pending imaging. No unilateral communications in the estate's name. All outbound notices through supervised trust channel. She said nothing. She signed the compliance acknowledgement where indicated and passed the pen back without looking at me. In the archive room, fluorescent strips flickered once before stabilizing. Metal shelving lined the walls with labeled bankers' boxes. Board minutes, vessel titles, foundation grants, estate drafting. I checked each item against the preliminary inventory and logged discrepancies in real time. The practical daughter role she had assigned me for years became, finally, jurisdiction. The cream envelope suspending my credentials was scanned into Exhibit Retaliatory Communications and filed. The water-warped legal pad from Halbrecht and Wynne, with quotes and timestamps from the day I was excluded, was scanned as a contemporaneous memo and then placed in my own locked file, noted as non-dispositive personal record, not evidence abandoned and not left for someone else to reinterpret later. At 3:17 p.m, we opened the family office outbound mail queue under supervision. 3 draft announcements were waiting, all prepared after my father's death, each naming Dalton as sole continuity heir and omitting me entirely. They were never sent. The metadata showed saved, revised, held. I had them preserved as unsent administrative artifacts and moved to the court production folder, distinctive detail resolved. At 4:02 p.m, the court's document examiner delivered the preliminary written report to Counsel of Record. No immediate signs of fabrication in the second will. Notarization index consistent. Witness identifiers valid pending in-person confirmation at final evidentiary date. Nora called from her office to read the key lines verbatim, then emailed the PDF while we were still in the archive room. "We're past threshold," she said. "They can contest interpretation, not existence." "Understood," I answered. "Go home when you finish." "I will." Before I left the house, I walked to the study window where my father used to review ledgers at dusk. The lake was flat and grey under low cloud, docks empty, wind pressing small ripples towards shore. Dalton remained in the front hall with his attorney, signing the bequest acknowledgement that separated his personal inheritance from fiduciary control. He did not ask to speak again. Marianne stayed in the dining room with her counsel and never came to the doorway. Whatever sentence she had stopped on in court remained unfinished, and by then I understood it always would. I drove back to the office at sunset for one final signature session with the trustee liaison. The board emergency notice went out under my authority and court supervision. Language stripped of theatre. Governance control updated by judicial order. Operations continue. Employee payroll and vendor obligations unchanged. Inquiries routed through interim administration. I signed the transmission log, watched the send confirmations appear one by one, and attached the receipts to the case chronology. Every call answered, every report routed, every item accounted for. When the floor emptied and the lights shifted to night mode, I sat alone at the same walnut table where I had spent years preparing work credited to other names. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the vent and the click of my pen against paper. I wrote the last line in my notebook beneath the day's timestamps. Authority assumed, record complete, no pending informal channels. Then I signed my full name exactly once, in steady block letters, and closed the cover. Silence was not peace. It was the price I had paid to survive their version of order, and I was no longer paying it. My name was Avery Elaine Cooper, and in the room where they had tried to leave me blank, I had entered myself into the record in ink that would not wash out.